People think power in the underworld roars. It doesn't. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner, pouring your scotch, completely ignored, until the day a 250-pound enforcer makes the wrong move, and the silent girl in the pastel dress casually snaps his neck. That's when everything changes. Dominic Falcone did not look twice at the people who served him. In his world, attention was a currency reserved strictly for threats, rivals, and beautiful distractions. Everyone else was simply furniture, a part of the heavily guarded ecosystem that allowed the Falcone syndicate to run the criminal underbelly of Chicago's Gold Coast. Clara Hayes was, by all accounts, the most unassuming piece of furniture in his mansion. She had been hired 2 years ago as a personal assistant, a favor to a retiring capo who had claimed she was good with schedules and keeping her mouth shut. Clara was 26, with mousy brown hair she kept pulled back in a severe low bun. She favored oversized knit sweaters, sensible flat shoes, and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down the bridge of her nose. When Dominic held meetings with his lieutenants in the sprawling, mahogany-paneled library of his estate, Clara was always there. She stood flush against the far wall, a shadow blending into the leather-bound encyclopedias, holding a silver tray of espresso or a digital tablet with his daily itinerary. She never spoke unless spoken to. She never made eye contact. When the men in the room made crude jokes, she didn't blush. She simply didn't react. When guns were slammed onto the heavy oak desk, she didn't flinch. Dominic simply assumed she was too naive or too deeply terrified to process the reality of her environment. "She's like a ghost, Dom," his right-hand man Gabriel had mentioned once over a glass of bourbon. "I walked into the study yesterday and didn't even realize she was standing there for 10 minutes. It's unnatural." Dominic had barely looked up from his ledger. "As long as my coffee is hot and my meetings are scheduled, I don't care if she haunts the place. She's quiet. Quiet is safe." That quiet was not safe. Quiet was merely waiting. The fragile peace in Chicago had begun to fracture in the brutal cold of late November. The Rossi family, operating out of the South Side, had grown tired of their territorial boundaries. Stefano Rossi, an old-school brute who believed fear was the only valid form of leadership, had started bleeding into Falcone territory. It started small, a hijacked shipment of imported silks here, a roughed-up bookie there. But Stefano had recently handed the reins of his street operations to his nephew, Leo Rossi. Leo was a monster of a man, standing 6'4", built like a brick wall and fueled by a volatile cocktail of cocaine and unearned arrogance. He lacked his uncle's cautious cunning. Leo wanted war, and he wanted the glory of taking down the untouchable Dominic Falcone. The tension reached a boiling point when 3 of Dominic's men were found beaten to near death outside a warehouse in the West Loop. Dominic knew that a retaliatory strike would plunge the city into a bloodbath, drawing the eyes of the feds. He preferred surgical precision. He preferred to cut the head off the snake in a room where nobody was watching. A sit-down was arranged. The location was the Obsidian, a high-end, supposedly neutral private club owned by Vincent Romano. The terms were strict. Dominic and Stefano were allowed to bring only 1 man each. No weapons drawn. A civilized discussion to redraw the lines and pull Leo back by his leash. On the evening of the meeting, an unprecedented winter storm battered the city, dumping a foot of snow on the streets and gridlocking traffic. Gabriel, Dominic's intended muscle for the night, was T-boned by a skidding semi-truck on the expressway. He survived, but with a fractured ribs and a totaled SUV, he wasn't making the sit-down. Dominic stood in the foyer of his mansion, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit, his jaw tight with irritation. Going in alone to meet the Rosses was practically inviting an assassination attempt, even on neutral ground. "Mr. Falcone." The soft, even voice made him turn. Clara stood near the coat check holding his cashmere overcoat. She was wearing a plain, tailored gray dress that went past her knees. "Gabriel is out. Call Romano." "Tell him we postpone," Dominic barked. snatching the coat from her hands. "Romano is already there, sir," Clara said mildly, not backing away from his sharp tone. "Stefano and Leo Rossi have also arrived. If you cancel now, they will take it as a sign of weakness. Leo has already been boasting to his men that you are afraid." Dominic paused, his dark eyes narrowing as he finally truly looked at his assistant. "And how would you know what Leo Rossi is boasting about?" Clara adjusted her slipping glasses. "I monitor their known associates' social media and encrypted chatter, sir. It is part of the itinerary risk assessment." Dominic let out a harsh breath, running a hand through his dark hair. "I can't walk into a room with Stefano and that rabid dog Leo without a second. The optics are terrible." "Take me," Clara said. Dominic actually laughed. It was a cold, humorless sound. "You? What are you going to do, Clara? Offer them an espresso while they put a bullet in my kneecap?" The term stated you are allowed one person to accompany you. "They did not specify it had to be a bodyguard," Clara replied, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. "If you walk in with your personal assistant, it sends a clearer message than walking in with a gun thug. It tells them you do not view them as a threat. It tells them this is merely a business transaction to you. An administrative errand." Dominic stared at her. The logic was surprisingly sound. It was an ultimate display of arrogance, bringing a meek, bespectacled girl to a mob summit. It would infuriate Leo and confuse Stefano. "Fine," Dominic said, turning toward the door. "Keep your mouth shut, stay in the corner, and whatever happens, do not scream." "I never scream, Mr. Falcone," she said softly, following him out into the freezing night. The Obsidian was entirely empty save for the bartender polishing glasses in the front and the heavy, suffocating silence of the VIP room in the back. The walls were lined with dark velvet, soaking up the ambient sound, making the space feel like a vacuum. Dominic sat at the head of a long marble table. Stefano Rossi sat opposite him, looking like a crumbling Roman emperor in a flashy, outdated pinstripe suit. Standing directly behind Stefano was Leo. The nephew was practically vibrating with aggressive energy, his massive fists clenching and unclenching. He wore a tight black turtleneck that emphasized his steroid-inflated muscles, a gold chain resting against his thick neck. Clara stood exactly where Dominic had ordered her, in the back corner near the door, a leather portfolio pressed to her chest. She looked entirely out of place, a fragile sparrow trapped in a cage with wolves. "3 of my men, Stefano," Dominic said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. He didn't even look at Leo. "Hospitalized. Your boy here lacks discipline." Stefano chuckled, the wet, rattling sound. "Boys will be boys, Dominic. You push into the South Side transit routes, there's going to be friction." Leo was just asserting our boundaries. "They weren't your boundaries," Dominic replied coolly. "You signed the transit rights over to me 3 years ago in exchange for the dockyards. Do I need to have my assistant pull up the ledger?" He gestured vaguely toward Clara's corner without looking at her. Leo scoffed loudly, stepping forward. "We don't give a damn about some old paper, Falcone. You're getting soft." Sitting up in your ivory tower, bringing a little secretary to a sit-down. Leo's eyes, blown white with chemical aggression, locked onto Clara. He sneered. "What's the matter, Dom? Couldn't find a man brave enough to walk in here with you?" "Leo, quiet," Stefano warned, though his tone was weak. "No, uncle," Leo snapped, pacing around the side of the table, moving closer to Dominic. "I'm tired of this arrogant prick. He walks in here with a skirt, thinking he's untouchable, thinking we're just going to sit here and play nice." Dominic remained perfectly still, his hands folded on the marble table. "Take another step toward me, Leo, and I will ensure you leave this room in a customized urn." Leo let out a barking laugh. You ain't armed. Romano patted us all down at the door, and Gabriel ain't here to save you." Leo's eyes darted around the room, his drug-addled brain looking for maximum leverage, a way to humiliate the great Dominic Falcone. His gaze landed back on Clara, who was standing completely still, watching the exchange with blank eyes behind her glasses. "Let's see how cool you are when things get messy," Leo growled. Before Stefano could stop him, Leo lunged. But he didn't lunge at Dominic. He bypassed the table entirely and charged the corner where Clara stood. It was a classic bully's move, target the weakest thing in the room to break the strong man's composure. Leo intended to grab the girl, terrify her, maybe break an arm to show Dominic he was utterly powerless to protect his own people. Dominic's heart spiked. He pushed his chair back, shouting, "Leo, don't!" But the warning was entirely unnecessary. As the 250-pound enforcer closed the distance, reaching out with a massive, meaty hand to grab Clara by the throat, the invisible ghost of the Falcone syndicate vanished. Clara didn't cower, she didn't drop her portfolio, she didn't even gasp. With terrifying fluid speed, Clara dropped beneath Leo's outstretched arm. It wasn't a panicked duck, it was a calculated, precise evasion. As Leo's momentum carried him forward, Clara pivoted sharply on her sensible flat shoes. She drove the heavy, reinforced spine of her leather portfolio directly upward into the radial nerve of Leo's extended arm. Leo let out a sharp, breathless grunt as his arm instantly went numb, dropping uselessly to his side. Before the giant man could even process the sudden deadness in his limb, Clara had already moved. She stepped perfectly into his guard, invading his personal space with the grace of a dancer and the malice of an apex predator. She reached up, her small, pale hands latching onto his thick neck. It happened in the span of 3 seconds. Her left hand anchored the back of his skull, her right palm slammed against his jawline. She didn't use her own arm strength. She used her entire body weight, twisting her hips and dropping her center of gravity in a brutal, highly advanced martial throw, combined with a cervical torsion technique. Crack! The sound echoed through the velvet-lined room like a gunshot. It was a wet, heavy, horrifying noise, the sound of thick bone and cartilage completely severing. Leo's eyes rolled back into his head before his body even hit the floor. He collapsed like a puppet with its strings abruptly cut, dead before his massive frame slammed against the hardwood, shaking the heavy marble table. Silence slammed back into the room, absolute and deafening. Stefano Rossi had half risen from his chair, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream, his face drained of all color. He stared at the mountainous corpse of his nephew, then slowly, terrifyingly, raised his eyes to the girl in the gray dress. Dominic was frozen. He was a man who had seen violence in every conceivable form. He had ordered hits, witnessed executions, and fought for his life in gutters and penthouses alike. But he had never in his entire life seen anything like this. Clara stood over the colossal corpse of Leo Rossi. She wasn't breathing heavily. There was no adrenaline shake in her hands. She calmly reached down, picked up the leather portfolio she had dropped during the maneuver, and dusted off the cover. She then reached up and casually pushed her wire-rimmed glasses back up the bridge of her nose. She turned her head, looking at Dominic with the exact same blank, polite expression she wore when asking him about his lunch preferences. "I apologize for the interruption, Mr. Must." "Falcone," Clara said softly, her voice perfectly level. "Shall I call Romano to arrange for a clean-up, or would you prefer to finish your negotiations with Mr. Rossi first?" Dominic just stared at her. The mousy hair, the sensible shoes, the bloodless clinical execution of a man 3 times her size. Who the hell is this woman? Stefano suddenly choked on a sob, falling backward into his chair, his hands raised in surrender as if Clara might teleport across the room and snap his neck next. What is she?" Stefano stammered, tears of sheer terror pricking his eyes. "What did you bring into this room, Dominic?" Dominic slowly closed his open mouth. The shock was receding, rapidly being replaced by a dark, surging thrill. He looked at the trembling Mafia boss across the table, then at the dead giant on the floor, and finally at the quiet girl standing at his side. He smoothly adjusted his suit jacket and sat back down, steepling his fingers. He didn't know who Clara really was, but right now she was his. "I brought my assistant Stefano," Dominic said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Now, let's talk about those transit routes." The ride back to the Gold Coast estate in the armored Maybach was completely silent. But the quality of the silence had fundamentally changed. Before, Clara's silence was a void, an empty space Dominic ignored. Now it was a physical weight in the car, heavy and humming with lethal electricity. Dominic poured himself 2 fingers of scotch from the crystal decanter in the console. His hands were completely steady, but his mind was running through 1,000 terrifying, exhilarating calculations. He glanced at the rearview mirror. Clara sat in the corner of the leather seat, staring out at the snow-covered streets of Chicago, looking exactly as she had for 2 years. They arrived at the mansion. Dominic bypassed his usual security detail with a sharp wave of his hand. "No one disturbs me. Gabriel, when he gets out of the hospital, is the only exception," he barked at the head guard. He strode into his private study, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind them. He didn't sit behind his desk. He turned, leaning against the polished mahogany, nursing his scotch, and watched Clara stand by the door, her hands respectfully clasped in front of her gray dress. "Take off the glasses, Clara," Dominic commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she reached up and pulled the wire-rimmed frames from her face, folding them and sliding them into her pocket. Now the hair. Her pale hands reached to the back of her neck, pulling the pins from the severe bun. Heavy dark brown waves cascaded down her shoulders, completely altering the geometry of her face. Without the oversized glasses and the pullback hair, the mousy secretary vanished. Beneath the disguise was a strikingly sharp jawline, high cheekbones, and a pair of piercing ice-blue eyes that held absolutely no fear. "Your posture," Dominic added, taking a slow step toward her. "Drop the act." Clara exhaled slowly. The slouch disappeared. Her shoulders squared, her spine straightened, and her stance widened by 2 inches. Suddenly, the plain gray dress didn't look frumpy. It looked like a tactical compromise on a woman built out of tensile steel. Dominic stopped a foot away from her, towering over her, his dark eyes searching hers. "Who are you?" "My name is Clara Hayes." "That part is true," she said, her voice dropping the mild, deferential pitch she'd used for 2 years. Her real voice was richer, smoother, and laced with absolute authority. "Who do you work for? The feds?" "The Italian Commission. If you are a mole for the cartel, I will have you dismantled in the basement, regardless of what you did to Leo." Clara actually smiled. It was a terrifyingly beautiful thing, a smirk that promised violence. "I don't work for anyone, Dominic. Not anymore. I used to work for Academy." Dominic's eyes narrowed, recognizing the real private name immediately. Academy, the private military company formerly known as Blackwater, a global mercenary outfit that handled black ops, elite security, and foreign regime changes for the highest bidder. "You're a PNC contractor?" he asked, disbelief mingling with a sudden dark surge of respect. "A mercenary. I was Tier 1 intelligence and direct action," Clara corrected softly. 3 years ago, I was contracted to retrieve stolen corporate data from a broker in Vienna, a man named Arthur Sterling. Sterling wasn't just trading corporate secrets, he was trading names of deep-cover operatives. I burned his servers, took his money, and put a bullet in his kneecap. He put a $10 million bounty on my head. "So you hid," Dominic realized, the pieces locking into place. "You came to Chicago and buried yourself in the criminal underworld." "I needed a shield." Clara stepped closer, closing the distance between them until he could smell the faint scent of rain and gunpowder on her skin. "I researched every syndicate in the country. Your organization was the most paranoid, the most heavily fortified, and the most aggressively vetted. Nobody lives for a ghost inside a fortress. I forged a background, paid off your retiring couple to vouch for me, and became your invisible assistant. You used my syndicate as a meat shield." Dominic growled, his hands gripping the edge of the desk behind him to keep from grabbing her. He was furious, yes, but beneath the anger was an undeniable, blazing attraction. She had played him perfectly. I provided flawless administrative support in exchange, Clara replied, a hint of dry humor in her ice-blue eyes. Your profit margins are up 12% since I reorganized your offshore accounts, and I just saved your life. I'd say we're even. Dominic let out a rough laugh, shaking his head. He reached out, his large hand wrapping around the back of her neck, his thumb resting against her pulse point. Her heart was beating at a perfectly steady, calm rhythm. I should kill you for the deception, he whispered, leaning down until his lips were inches from hers. You could try, Clara whispered back, not breaking eye contact. But you're out of espresso, and Gabriel is in the hospital. You need me. Dominic's controls snapped. He pulled her flush against his chest, crashing his mouth down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision of power, a brutal, consuming claim. Clara responded with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his expensive tailored suit. Pushing him back against the heavy mahogany desk, the quiet girl was gone forever, replaced by a queen built for his dark, violent world. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Dominic rested his forehead against hers. You're no longer my assistant, he ordered, his voice rugged. You stand at my right hand, and God help anyone who tries to collect that bounty. 2 months later, the ecosystem of the Falcone Syndicate had been entirely rewritten. Clara Hayes no longer wore oversized sweaters or stood in the corners of rooms. She wore sharp, tailored designer suits, a concealed Sig Sauer P36 strapped to her thigh, and she sat at the main table. To the lower-level soldiers, she was terrifying the Widowmaker who had snapped a Rossi enforcer's neck with her bare hands. To Dominic, she was his most trusted lieutenant, his fiercest protector, and the only woman who had ever truly understood the darkness inside him. But hiding in plain sight only works until the spotlight finds you. Stefano Rossi, broken and humiliated by the loss of his nephew, had not been idle. Desperate for revenge and too cowardly to strike directly, Stefano had utilized his offshore contacts to investigate the mysterious woman who had killed Leo. He had found Arthur Sterling. The ambush happened on a Tuesday night. Dominic and Clara were leaving Gibson's Bar and Steakhouse on Rush Street, stepping out of the warm, bustling restaurant into the biting Chicago wind. The valet was jogging toward them with the keys to the armored SUV. Clara's instincts flared a microsecond before the trap sprang. "Down!" she screamed, shoving Dominic hard against the brick facade of the restaurant just as the windows of a black, unmarked van across the street blew open. Deafening automatic gunfire ripped through the night air. The valet went down in a spray of blood. The heavy glass windows of Gibson shattered, sending screaming patrons diving beneath their tables. "Sterling's men?" Dominic shouted over the roar of a second volley, drawing the custom 1911 pistol from his shoulder holster. "Or Stefano's, doesn't matter, they all died the same." Clara yelled back. She rode out from behind the stone pillar, coming up onto one knee. She didn't fire blindly, she moved with terrifying mechanical precision. Bang, 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 2 clean shots through the windshield of the van. The driver slumped over the steering wheel, laying on the horn. 4 men in matte black tactical gear poured out of the back of the van, armed with compact submachine guns. These weren't street thugs. Their movements were disciplined, military-grade. Sterling had sent his best academy-trained hunters. "Move to the alley," Dominic ordered, laying down covering fire. His shots were brutal, blowing up the chest plate of the nearest mercenary. Clara sprinted in unison with him, their movements perfectly synchronized, a deadly dance they had spent the last 2 months perfecting. They ducked into the narrow, frozen alleyway beside the restaurant, using the heavy dumpsters for cover. "We are pinned," Dominic yelled as high-caliber rounds chewed into the brickwork above their heads, raining red dust down on them. "They have superior firepower." "They have a bottleneck," Clara corrected, ejecting her spent magazine and sliding a fresh one home with a sharp click. "Cover my 6." Before Dominic could protest, Clara vaulted over the dumpster. She didn't run away from the gunfire. She used the shadows of the alley, wall-jumping off a fire escape ladder to gain high ground on a low-hanging fire balcony. The mercenaries surged into the mouth of the alley, their weapons raised, expecting to trap their targets. Instead, death rained from above. Clara dropped from the fire escape directly behind the lead mercenary, wrapping her legs around his neck in a brutal flying triangle choke, snapping his neck with the momentum of her fall, while simultaneously firing 3 rounds into the man next to him. Dominic broke from cover, his 1911 roaring. He took the third man down with a shot to the throat, then engaged the final mercenary in brutal hand-to-hand combat as the man's gun jammed. Dominic drove his knee into the man's ribs, hearing them crack, before bringing the heavy steel butt of his pistol down on his skull. The alley fell dead silent, save for the wailing of police sirens in the distance. Dominic stood panting, blood splattered across his white dress shirt. He turned to look at Clara. She was standing amidst the bodies of highly trained killers, breathing heavily, a shallow cut bleeding down her cheekbone, her eyes blazing with adrenaline and raw power. She wasn't a ghost, she was a goddamn force of nature. Dominic walked toward her, dropping his empty gun. He didn't care about the sirens or the bodies. He reached out, his blood-stained hands cupping her face, smearing crimson against her pale skin. "Sterling is going to keep sending them," Clara gasped, looking up into his eyes. "Stefano will keep paying them." "Let them come," Dominic said fiercely, his thumb brushing over the cut on her cheek. "Sterling, Rossi, the Commission, the whole damn world. We will bury them all." He kissed her, tasting gunpowder, copper, and absolute loyalty. In the blood-soaked alley behind Rush Street, the final vestige of Clara the assistant died, and the queen of the Falcone syndicate was crowned. A week later, a heavy wooden box was delivered to Arthur Sterling's private estate in London, containing the severed heads of his elite hit squad and a note written in elegant administrative handwriting. "Consider my resignation permanent." The underworld learned a valuable lesson that winter. Power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it wears a quiet dress, pours your coffee, and waits for the perfect moment to burn your entire world to ashes. Did this story leave you breathless? The underworld is full of hidden secrets, but nothing is more dangerous than a quiet woman with a dark past. If you loved this intense mafia romance, hit that like button, share this video with your fellow dark romance addicts, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling stories. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a plot twist.